Small Conifers for Small Gardens is my first conifer book. And in this conifer book, I wrote about dwarf and miniature conifers, and it was focused on dwarf miniature conifers. And I did this different than most conifer books that have been written, in which I told stories about the history behind the plant, or how I found the plant, or some story involving the plant. I tried to make a very readable book so that it wouldn't just sit on a shelf somewhere and only be opened on occasion. The plants I want to talk about from this book today are a few forms of the real dwarf forms of Pinus strobus. The plant called Pinus strobus Horsford, that was one of my first miniature conifers, and it's always been very special to me. It was found in the 1960s in New England, actually up in Vermont, by a guy named Bill Horsford. Now the story is on page 230 in this book. And Bill Horsford was a friend with Greg Williams, and he shared wood with him. And Greg and Lane Ziegenfuss were partners in plant explorations, and Lane had a nursery called Hillside Nursery. And Pinus strobus Horsford was propagated by Lane and Greg, and it was introduced through Hillside Nursery. And it soon became the standard that everybody wanted when they wanted a dwarf conifer, one that was reliably dwarf. Much smaller growing than Pinus strobus nana, which is kind of a catch-all name anyway. The neat thing about Pinus strobus Horsford is that it tends to have needles that are as long as or even longer than the annual growth. So it makes a dense, shaggy little bun. Because of that, it needs some special care, because I noticed that when they got to be between about 15 years old, they would start to die, and they'd die over a 2 or 3 year period. Sections of the plant would die, and then eventually the whole thing died. I didn't have that problem because I was a propagator, and the way I propagated Horsford was I would cut holes in the plant. I'd take big chunks out of it so the air could move through it. And when I cut the chunks out of it, I clean out all the needles and everything, and then I didn't seem to have a problem with it. So I think the reason it's dying for other people was they didn't clean it out in the winter, and when the spring came and it was rainy, they were attacked by a fungus. When the new growth came out, new growth would wilt and die, and so the plant would gradually die. And so opening it up was very important. It's very important with all these really tight forms of Pinus strobus. Now the original plant no longer exists. Bill Horsford planted it near his home in a field, and the problem was horses also were in the field, and a horse stepped on it and smashed it, and it no longer exists. Horsford never looked back where he found the plant. He found it as a plant, not as a witch's broom. And he looked back to see, he never went back exploring to look to see if there might be a witch's broom in the area that could have dropped seed that would have produced Horsford. Because I believe that Pinus strobus Horsford is actually a witch's broom seedling. But a broom was never found in that area that may have seeded it, because nobody ever really looked for it. Now there are a couple other forms that are very similar, or a couple other selections that are very similar to Horsford. Pinus strobus Uncatena is a lot like Horsford, and so is Pinus strobus Greg. Pinus strobus Greg and Uncatena are both witch's broom seedlings. Pinus strobus Greg came from Greg Williams. He grew some seedlings from Pinus strobus Horsham, and one of the seedlings was very dwarf, and he shared it and eventually got the name Greg, and it grows similar to Horsford with some differences. Greg has shorter needles, and short needles tend to form around the buds for Pinus strobus Greg. You don't have that in Pinus strobus Horsford. Pinus strobus Uncatena also has shorter needles than Horsford, and it has a little bit faster growth rate, so it may be just a slight bit more open than Horsford. And Uncatena came from Al Fordham. Now Al Fordham was messing around with witch's broom seedlings, and I talk about a couple of Al's plants on page 232. And on page 232 I have a story of Pinus strobus Merrimack. And on 233 I have a picture of Merrimack, and also have a picture of Merrimack with Uncatena next to it. Now, if you want to see really great pictures of these plants, then I suggest that if you don't already have it, you think of maybe purchasing my DVD, where I have high-res pictures of all the plants in this book, and it's set up like a website. But Merrimack was a witch's broom seedling that Al Fordham grew along with Uncatena. Merrimack grows maybe 50% faster than Uncatena. It had more commercial potential than Uncatena or Horsford, and it is still much tighter than the form they call Nana. Now, the thing about Merrimack is that it's real easy to identify, because in the winter it goes off color and takes a yellowish color to the foliage. It grows about 2 inches a year, and the color change adds some more interest to it in the landscape. But it's a very tight plant, and Al called it Merrimack because that's an Indian term, means winding river. And Al used Indian names for his introductions. Now, the Pinus strobus sea urchin is another very small selection of Pinus strobus. And Pinus strobus sea urchin was a selection from Sid Waxman. And it can be almost confused with Horsford, except it has a definite bluish tint to the foliage. And of these 4 plants, I think sea urchin might be the one that's becoming the most popular because of the bluish color. When I visited Sydney in the late 1970s, he gave me a tour of his facility. And on the facility there were thousands of witch's broom seedlings growing in long straight rows. At one time he had over 15,000 of them. He was making selections, and he showed me all of his selections he had made up to that time. He showed me Yukon, Green Shadow, Blue Shag, and Sea Urchin. He sent me signwood of all these, and I was able to introduce them through Coenosium Gardens. But Sea Urchin itself, Sidney told me it was a very difficult one to graft. He had problems trying to produce it. I never really had much difficulty with it, and I kind of found Sea Urchin to be very, very nice and very small in the garden. A very choice plant. And once again, it has to have holes cut in it to prevent dieback during the spring. If you want a sea urchin to live more than 10 to 15 years, cut holes in it during the winter. You might not like the appearance of the holes, but they disappear the following spring when the new growth comes in. That was the most dwarf of all his selections. Yukon was selected because he wanted Pinus strobus that would be great for large hedges, because it's very dense and grows fairly fast, but it's still not a tree form. Green Shadow was a dark green selection that grows 50% faster than what's commonly sold as Nana. And Blue Shag has replaced Nana in most garden centers, because Blue Shag has a definite bluish color to the foliage. But those are some of Sid's early introductions. Sidney, I don't know how many plants he introduced for sure, but there must be at least 20 introductions from him from his witch's broom seedling work. It may even be more than that. But these particular dwarf forms of Pinus strobus that I talked about today are interesting ones. They're nice ones, and you should have at least one of these in your collection because they don't take up much space, and they're very attractive, and they've been around for a while, so we know how they perform. Now, when I talk about plants from this book, I will do it in pretty much the way I did the dwarf forms of Pinus strobus. I'll talk about several different selections, and I'll refer to the pages where I found them. So I hope you enjoyed this talk, and next time we'll see. Maybe I'll do another one from this book or from my other books. I have 5 books to pick from, so I have lots of information. And if these videos catch on, there's going to be quite a few of them on the internet. If you survived going through all my talking tonight, thank you, and enjoy your conifers.